Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Welcome to this new 6-part special episode by the Review of Religions, where we will be discussing race and equality and race relations. As everyone is aware, some time ago, the killing of an innocent man, George Floyd, in the United States of America, who was killed by a police person who placed his knee over his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he said and he exclaimed, "I cannot breathe," and he called for his mother. There was protests globally, and while such incidents have happened before and have led to a reaction and media response and attention being given to it, the global response to this particular incident is unparalleled in recent times. It's become the subject of top discussions and conversations all across the world, not just in the United States of America. For example, here I'm now in the United Kingdom. This has been quite a hot issue in recent times. And people are asking difficult questions about why this racism still exists in the 21st century and how we can solve it, more importantly. So many different approaches have been proposed about how we should eliminate institutionalized racism. In these particular shows, we're going to be addressing these issues and providing a solution or solutions which may be of interest to many people. I'm delighted to be joined today by esteemed guests from across the pond in the United States of America. First of all, I introduce Maulana Azhar Haneef, who is an imam of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. He is the missionary in charge of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, United States of America. He's also the vice president of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, United States of America. And I'm delighted to welcome Maulana Azhar Haneef to the show today. Maulana Saab, peace be upon you.
Thank you, Safiya Saab.
I'm also really pleased to introduce Dr. Hassan Wahab, who is currently a lecturer in political science at the Ghana University. He's also been a lecturer at political science at Chicago State University, and he was also the editor of the Africa Today journal from Indiana University for over 7 years. He's also linked with the Review of Religions as the editor of our Race and Equality section. Dr. Hassan, peace be upon you and welcome to our show.
Jazakallah, thank you for having me. I am in Chicago now, thanks to COVID-19. All borders are shut, so I'm locked up here. But you are right that I'm in Ghana these days.
Last but not least, peace be upon you to Dr. Basiyr Rodney, who is a doctor of education. He's also a community activist as well as professor. He's currently the department chair at Webster University in St. Louis in Missouri. He works to prepare a new generation of caring, reflective, equity-minded, and innovative teachers. So he's also the president of PAMA, which is the Pan-African Ahmadiyya Muslim Association, United States of America. I would like to add that today we've tried to bring people this issue that has, in a way, been not raised because this issue has happened before, but this issue which has captured global attention through the killing of George Floyd. What started with an issue that began in the United States of America, or the reaction we saw in the United States of America, has now gone beyond the borders of the United States of America. Here in England, where I am sitting, this has become a hot issue, and this has become a national issue which is being discussed. And it's also, trespassed boundaries in other countries as well, whether it's Europe, whether it's in the Americas, and so on. So, Maulana Azhar Haneef Saab is based in America. He's African American. Dr. Basiyr Rodney is, from a Caribbean background. He's originally from Jamaica, but he's living in America now. And Hassan Wahab Saab has lived in America, I believe, for over 20. He lived there for over 20 years. Is that correct, Hassan Saab? You were there, and he's currently in Ghana, but he's originally from Africa. So we've brought this diverse panel because this is now a global issue, and I want to get straight to it. Azhar Saab, this incident of George Floyd was something that was very painful to watch, and it's very difficult to see somebody who clearly was not causing a threat at the time, to someone to lose his life in this callous manner. But this is not the first time. We've been here before. We've had similar incidents before with African Americans being killed in this manner. Why was this incident, do you think, of George Floyd? What did you feel when you saw this incident, and why do you think this incident captured the global attention in this way?
This incident struck a chord, struck a nerve, and went to the very root of what people feel was inhumanity. It went way beyond the issue of color and ethnicity and nationality. But when you treat someone of this magnitude, with that level of indifference and inhumanity, anyone watching, no matter what their positions may be in terms of politics or origin, etc., it begins to affect you deeply. Especially because, as you say, he cries out just before he's about to leave this world, and he identifies again what is common to all of us, mothers. And he cries for his mother, and every mother in the world can feel that this is now my child. And I think this is what really began to compel the world to step forward and say, enough is enough. We will not stoop to this level of inhumanity and injustice, even though, as you said, it happened before their eyes. All right, if I take it back, what was it that the civil rights movement in America had as their great dream? Martin Luther King said that, I dream that one day my children, my 4 little children, will live in a nation in which they will not ever be judged by their skin color. Not by the color of the skin, but by the content of character. And yet again, we see in that incident that that wasn't judgment based on a character, a crime that deserved that kind of punishment. That was solely because of the color of this person's skin. And this has caused an uproar in our nation by not just African Americans, but by all people of consciousness saying enough was enough. And as you say, it wasn't the first time. There's a lot of history that say this was a straw that broke our backs. If I look back just in one incident, almost 100 years ago, there was a young man, 17 years old, for no sake of other than it was a hot summer day and he wanted to go to swim in a local Michigan pond. He enters the water without realizing this is where, again, the color line had been drawn, and black were not allowed to swim in that part of the lake. So unfortunately, he moved into that part of the lake, and a white person who saw him was incensed, enraged, picks up a stone and begins stoning this young boy, preventing him from leaving the water, and he drowned. The result was almost exactly what you saw in the incident of George Floyd. Immediate social unrest. Rioting broke out. It took about, it was going on for days in a number of cities, they joined in these riots. And yet in this case, the strange thing was, it was the whites who were attacking the blacks and wound up killing about 40 of them, and about 500 were injured. So the whole issue of this racial disparity has been going on for a long time in our nation. And recently, just recently, going back about 8 years, you would say, with Trayvon Martin, people heard that name. Almost the exact same thing, 17-year-old boy. What was he doing? He was walking home from a small corner store with a bag of candy in his hands. But the neighborhood watchman sees this boy walk by, and suddenly he perceives a threat. Calls 911 and says that there's a boy walking, and I think he is involved in robbery, so I'm going to pursue him. They tell him, stop. Do not pursue the suspect. But he doesn't listen. It's his own mental outlook on life and perception of people of color as being violent and dangerous and criminal caused him to follow that young boy, confront him, and shoot him dead. The nation, again, was in an uproar. Our president at the time was Mr. Barack Obama, and he said that what a tragedy. All parents can feel the pain of the loss of this innocent boy. All of us would want to get to the root of this and find out what happened. And he said, if I had a son, he would look like this boy Trayvon. So again, he identifies the humanness of the element here. This was not just any incident. This was a human being, a young boy, innocent, who should not have died like that. Yet we see, despite that, there was no justice for Trayvon Martin. The person who shot him dead was found innocent, and he walked away. And this is what the world has been seeing, our nation's been seeing ever since. Case after case after case of now citizens or police shooting individuals dead simply because of the color of their skin, nothing to do with the quality of the crime. And they just said enough was enough, and this injustice should not go on any longer. So they've been out protesting and drawing attention to this, not just in America, but around the world. I think this is what really has struck the chord, inhumanity on a basic level.
Dr. Basiyr, you are in St. Louis, that's correct?
Yes, I'm in St. Louis.
And Ferguson is based in St. Louis, is that right?
Yeah, it is one of the municipalities just outside of the city of St. Louis in St. Louis County, yes.
So, of course, as Maulana Azhar was mentioning, that was also a focal point previously. Michael Brown and Ferguson. I remember in 2016, I actually traveled with some community activists to that site in Ferguson, and they were telling me about the whole event. So Dr. Basiyr, we're here now a few weeks after this, this inexplicable killing of George Floyd. Whoever saw it would undoubtedly be in pain seeing this video. I mean, how did we get here?
I mean, I think as I mentioned, and as we know from the history of our country, we find ourselves in a place where police was founded on principles really about disparity, to reinforce the social order. And much of that social order for the history of the nation was based on racist structures, slavery as a structure. Police pretty much was founded to keep people in slavery, to catch, liberated slaves who were running away and then put them back into slavery. And a lot of those actions of the police are enshrined in this idea that the police is really trying to protect what we describe as white supremacy, protect the social structures as they stand. So the rules around policing allow police a great deal of latitude when they come in contact with citizens in this way. And not to just put this on police, we have vigilante citizens, as in the case of Trayvon Martin, who are also killed in a similar fashion, because a big part of this is that if you're Black in America, all of those stereotypes and those negative elements that define and describe you mean that you don't have any real sound value. And so police go overboard all the time when they confront Black and brown citizens. And I think we ended up here because the cameras help us to see what's going on in ways that we would not have seen. We would have just heard these stories, right? But with the cameras, with the recordings, the entire world can see the way in which police treats people, the way in which vigilante citizens, again, Ahmaud Arbery, jogging through his neighborhood, ends up in an altercation with some vigilante citizens, and then he is shot to death right there on camera. And so we are able to see this now in a way, and the reaction is visceral because we are aware of the patterns. We've seen this history, and nobody can really hide it anymore. And it's really sharpened before our eyes and chronic. In just the last 6 months alone, we're talking about 4 cases or 5 cases of African Americans killed in this way, as well as rising cases of Hispanic Americans being killed in the same way as well, and Native Americans.
Dr. Hassan, so I wanted to know, because your perspective is interesting. You're in Ghana at the moment, but you studied in America for, you've been in America for over 20 years, and you've been in this academic field. How do you, what's interesting for me is that it's not just a thing which is linked to nationality when people see people of color in the United States of America. So for example, you are originally African, but when you are in America, they will not distinguish whether you are African or American, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? And so have you ever experienced this kind of discrimination? If so, could you describe it, just to exemplify the fact that in America it's not a matter of nationality as such, it's a matter of color? And what have you what can you give an example of what you might have faced during your time there?
My experience is that as driving on the streets of Chicago, I made a U-turn in an area where there wasn't any marked sign that you couldn't make a U-turn. And as soon as I made a U-turn, I saw a police car behind me with flashing dome lights, siren on, that I must stop. I stopped, and my first reaction was to roll down the window and put both of my hands through the window to let the officer know that I did not have a gun. because I knew that you could easily be killed for any mistake. You know, you are taking a driver's license or anything, and they will say that you are taking a gun. The feeling is real for African Americans, for Black people, that the slightest mistake we make, we will not get the type of treatment that they mete out to white people.
So, I mean, I want to go back to Maulana Azhar. I mean, how do we describe this experience in the sense that ethnic minorities can face discrimination in different ways? There might be Native Americans, there might be South Asians who are judged based on the fact that people consider all Muslims terrorists, or all people of a certain description with a beard terrorists. What's the historical difference that we find in African Americans relating to slavery, and why is that something which is not solved today, and that's still passed through this issue which has been, you know, for generations, and which wasn't dealt with for so long? It's surprising to think, you know, just some decades ago, half a century ago or a bit more, there were still laws in place in the United States. We had Jim Crow and we had other things happening where you actually had legalized divisions in the country, which may not be legalized in the same way now, but are still being played out. And this is a country which is, of course, considered to be one of the most enlightened countries in the world. Yet just, you know, half a century ago, you had these extreme divisions, and as you mentioned, you gave an example of 100 years ago, and you had, you know, these things. So what is that aspect of slavery which many people may not be completely familiar with, which still resonates today?
Slavery isn't something which was unique to the American experience. In fact, Dr. Rodney, coming from the Caribbean island, would be in that part of the Americas where the majority of slaves were sent and lived, not in the USA. Beyond Jamaica or the Caribbean belt, where you found many slaves were taken, the basic point is, after slavery was abolished in 1863 by the stroke of a pen of Abraham Lincoln, you can see that this proclamation only gave a physical freedom to slaves. They weren't allowed at that point to enter society and engage in, you know, economic, educational, housing benefits as the rest of society. It was at that point that institutions now began to put a new measure in place to ensure that these slaves would remain, you know, the working class, to keep the economic power of those in, you know, the whites intact. Now, this wasn't just limited to the South, it was also throughout the entire nation. So now you see the growth of new laws during Reconstruction and afterwards, the Jim Crow laws. For a while, there were laws that prevented blacks from voting. There were laws that prevent them from obtaining certain housing ability. There were laws that prevented them from entering schools, whether that is grade schools or colleges. If they would attempt to do so, they were met with extreme force from different groups such as the KKK and others, who would burn them out of their homes, who would kill them, who would abuse them, would beat them. I mean, there was a lot of oppression going on. So this concept of a free black man in America never really took place in the minds of those who were in power. And the whites always instituted things to keep them under check. Coming up to the present day, they would say, well, racism is a thing of the past. If that were true, if race was an issue of the past, then all the systems of institutionalization, all these centuries that continue to give privilege to a certain segment of society, those who were European, who were white, and denied those rights to other citizens, African Americans and Native Americans, the Latino population, and slowly the immigrants who came in from other nations, and up to now you see it happening against Muslims. That should not be the situation. So as I mentioned, we're still being judged by origin, by color, by our ethnicities, and not by our qualities, our characters, our conditions of worth in terms of an economic, a social, political construct. This is what's been going on in America. And so we are living in a world that condemns us to this kind of lifestyle, no matter who we are, no matter how educated you may be. A professor in Harvard, the police came one day to his door during the term of Mr. Obama and then knocked on his door and saw him there and were ready to arrest him, despite the fact that he showed that he was a professor of Harvard and that he lived in the home. So it didn't matter how much you achieve education. It doesn't matter what level of advancement you have in society. Nowadays, during the COVID-19 crisis, people are under the pandemic. And you see cases of people who try to go into private clubs in buildings and someone calls 911 on them because they think you're not supposed to be here. And he tells them that I am also a business owner in this building. This is where I work. And they say, no, I'm sorry, sir. You are not supposed to be here, meaning you as an African-American are not supposed to be the CEO of a corporation. You're not supposed to have that kind of accomplishment in society. So I don't believe you. I'm going to call 911. Same thing, young lady in a park walking her dog and a man tells this young lady, please put your dog on a leash. And she calls up 911 and says what? A black man is attacking me in a public park. Again, using the systemic structure to her advantage that people naturally think black people are violent, are criminal, and are always trying to attack the white, particularly the white women. This is what's going on. So all of us are affected by, you can say, the wind that blows to our nation. And this has caused the undercurrent that leads to police brutality and other issues that we're talking about today. But it's never been solved ever since we've been so-called emancipated. It's never been solved since we've been given voting rights in 1965. We're still being disenfranchised from voting. It's never been solved despite the fact that we have entertainers. We had Obama in the White House. We had Oprah in the industries. It didn't matter. People still viewed this class of citizen or people of color as inferior and having less value than the rest of the citizens in our nation.
That's a question, Dr. Basiyr, for the person outside of America. I mean, I had the opportunity in 2016 to travel extensively to over 22 to 25 states, and it opened my eyes to this divide, which is sometimes obvious and sometimes subtle. The obvious example I can think of is South Side and North Side Chicago, where you can literally, almost stand on a line and you look to one side where there is a predominantly white population. It's very affluent and very well taken care of and blooming with greenery, and there's very good police presence you can see. And then you literally look to the other side and you see deprivation. It's a predominantly black neighborhood. They even have buttons there, emergency buttons, that if there's a crime, you press this for emergency. And it's very broken down, and you can see there's a lack of attention, a lack of resources. In other places it may be more subtle, and in other places it could be obvious. What I mean is, I was able to see a bit of this in my travels, and I started to understand that it's not as it seems on the surface when you go deeper into American society. As Maulana Azhar touched on, people outside of America, or even inside America, they see Obama as a president. They see many people who are influential from the African American community, or they see sports people, etc., etc. And then they say that, look, African Americans have had the chance, or have the chance, and this shows they can reach up in society. So could you, what do you say to this? How would you explain to someone who's not familiar with these nuances that why does it seem on one hand you have an African American president? Does this not show, in answer to people who ask this question, that African Americans can reach to these levels of society? As I mentioned, I was able to see these nuances even in Chicago, when I raised this question, people were explaining to me, some of the nuances. So what's your take on this question?
Well, I think I like the fact that you foregrounded this question, because it is in fact a common question, right? And I'll think first through the affirmative. It is the case that the black people that preceded us here in the United States have fought really hard to open the society to us, meaning this new generation that has emerged. So we cannot discount the struggles that the people have struggled, and the prayers they have made, and the fights they have fought to ensure that we have access to the society. right? So that is actually happening. You know, African Americans and Black people are benefiting from the openness of the society. We are getting education in really high levels. We're voting in also high levels compared even to whites in some ways. We are building businesses and building families, and we're getting education and health and benefits of the society. Now, we completely agree, as you pointed out, that those benefits that we are seizing, that, you know, those opportunities that have been opened for us and that we are seizing are not equitably distributed. The street you described that splits Chicago into two in St. Louis, we call it the Del Mar Divide. The BBC did an article on that a few years ago, and the discussion about the Del Mar Divide is exactly as you state, that on one side of Del Mar Boulevard, you know, the houses literally cost what would be market rates, $100,000, $200,000. Some of those houses, just a half a mile of Del Mar, $800,000, $1 million. And when you cross over into the Black side of Del Mar, literally you pick up property for $1,000 from the city's land bank, right? Literally, I mean, it's uncanny. I've been in the United States for 20 years. I came out of South Florida and then came to Missouri. And when I saw some of these stark divides, it was shocking to me, because the divides are in South Florida too, but not always as stark. And South Florida was learning to struggle through some of that itself in a more mature way than I think we were doing. But in South Florida, it was Sistrunk Boulevard in the Fort Lauderdale area, right? This divided Black and white. So these are common areas. And that's really the problem. The problem that even though we have fought for opportunities and we've opened the society to opportunities, you still have the level of divides you have. And I think Maulana paints a very, very great picture for why we describe this kind of phenomenon, why this generation is describing this phenomenon in terms of what we call Black Lives Matter, right? Not from the political standpoint, I don't want to go there, but from the human affirming standpoint. If you can go through Chicago and feel it, if you can, and again, when you step into what we would describe as a white neighborhood or a good neighborhood, right? You walk into that space and nobody needs to tell you that the people that live here matter, right? Their alleyways are clean. You see Mr. Policeman and he'll wave at you even and tell you good morning in that neighborhood, right? Because especially if you look like, as far as he's concerned, you belong there, right? But literally you cross the block down the street and nothing, it's a wasteland, right? And this is America.
So Dr. Basiyr, I have a follow-up question, because you know, people not familiar with the situation may get this impression as if, God forbid, the African American community in the United States are all from impoverished backgrounds and uneducated, which is of course not the case. Even in this panel, we have Maulana Saab, we have two professors, we have many people who are in very, you know, high levels of education and who are doing well in society as well. So this is my question, you know, when we look at the African American community, it was mentioned before, there is a stereotype that they are of a certain background, a certain persuasion, and they're going to do certain acts. But yourself, as an academic, as a professor, you know, can you quantify this? You know, the African American community is not just a community who are, God forbid, fitting the stereotype. There are many very talented, educated, and well-to-do people. And in fact, that goes back when we were speaking of Chicago. One thing that was interesting when I was there, I learned that when the people moved and they migrated from being freed as slaves into these societies up north, because they were all south, and they moved to the north, I was shown around Chicago, you know, for over many decades, the African American community developed themselves into a very thriving society of educated people, and they showed me where the first newspaper was formed, African American newspaper and publication. So can you explain? So this wrong stereotype, which may be in the minds of people, let's be honest, people have this. It's not the case that they're all African Americans are like this, and it may seem silly for us to say this, but unfortunately the stereotype exists.
Yeah, it's definitely not silly, and we should definitely hold the view. One of the challenges of the experience of African Americans and Black people universally is that in order to have kept a system of enslavement in place for over 200 years and a corresponding system of domination for another 200 years, a narrative had to be painted that communicated a sense of inferiority. So we have to be clear about that. And I don't want us to ignore that history, because it's important to realize this, the way in which symbols were used and the way in which religion was used. In an earlier conversation, we talked about, the preponderance of the white Jesus throughout the Western Christianized world as a way to show that even your God, the structure of your worship is whitened, right? And when you look at the dictionary and how the words white is described versus the word black, right? The way in which Black people have been named and described as a part of the social manipulation and brainwashing to communicate that Black people are subhuman, right? And so once you start to understand that, you must begin to reject the narrative. You have to say to yourself, I will reject any narrative that communicates that Black people, or any group of people, but in this case, Black people in particular, are inferior, right? Once you start to deconstruct that narrative, you start to see what you just described, a phenomenon where Black people we hold all kinds of position in American and world society in terms of class and wealth. And there are Black billionaires, right? There are Black millionaires, and there are Black educated people, and there are Black moms and wives and mothers, and there are Black fathers. I mean, that's one of the biggest myths that we have to shatter, because a part of what the system of the African Holocaust, some people call it, did was to break the structure of the Black household and then communicate that Black fathers don't care about their kids, right? So all of these things, they were published in newspapers and magazines, and just a whole brainwashing of the world population. So right now we have to reject that and show otherwise. And I'll give you some quick facts. You mentioned the point after Reconstruction. In the world of the United States, African Americans built what we call Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Thriving Black community with, anything you can think of, movie theaters, banks, Black professionals, because they had a lot of skills having come out of the period of enslavement, and they put that to work in their communities. We built universities. We still have historically Black colleges in the United States that date back to that period of time when Black people were building their own universities for their children, right? And their families. We built grade schools because this was a segregated time. So Black people had to build the schools that were going to educate their kids, right? In South Carolina, Black politicians became the majority in the state house, right? In North Carolina, Black politicians would collude with other whites and also occupy big positions in the state house. And so the reality that Blacks have moved up in the society was very real. But as Maulana Sahib explained, there was a systematic attempt to destroy those, right? So the reason why we don't associate is because of the narrative and the brainwashing, but also because of attempts to completely obliterate that. But that is certainly not the case today. And we can see many, many examples of Blacks moving up in the society and demonstrating that they can show great efficacy in the society.
Dr. Hassan.
I'm Mustafi, if I can just add one other
of
point
course.
on
Of
this same
can,
topic.
Maulana.
Very critical is we receive our information not from personal experience, but through the lens of the person who's filming it, and through the words of the one who's writing it. So a lot of information in the past was coming through books and through films. And the general narrative in these media was to portray certain groups in a very negative light. Up to now, Hollywood is being challenged and industry is being challenged the way they have been producing things with imagery, just the look of the person. So with the recent protests, a lot of companies have been gone back to, they call it reimagine their marketing, because they had used images of an era in our nation, which had very negative connotations when you had those looks. And also the films that were being produced in our own nation's capital. Films produced by Hollywood were being, raved that this is one of the great films of all time. What did it show? Again, it showed the enslavement. It showed the encroachment of rights of the Black people, and showed them a very, very negative, portrayals. So you can't discount the power of media, the power of movies, to impact the mindset of a whole generation of people and generations after that who've been feeding themselves on consuming these images and reading these books about Black people for all these years. That's one of the most powerful psychological tools that any nation can use to control the masses. And it's all been used against Black people.
I've always, the point that Dr. Basiyr mentioned about this white Jesus, I've always wondered about this. And Dr. Hassan, I wanted to ask you, and echoing what Maulana Azhar was saying about these perceptions that are created in society which build these stereotypes, because this was the question I had. And from a point of view of, in Africa, a message of this white Jesus, if it's brought, and I understand there's different depictions of Jesus that are in different places. Jesus, peace be upon him. And for those of our viewers who are not familiar, in Islam as well, Jesus is revered as a prophet of God, and he holds a noble status for all Muslims, and it's a part of our faith to believe in him as a prophet of God. So, Dr. Hassan, just a day ago or yesterday, here in the UK, the Archbishop of Canterbury, one of the highest authorities in the Anglican Church, he was asked this question, that nowadays we see a lot of these statues getting taken down or getting requests to be taken down for people who were former slave owners, and people felt that, why are these people, do they have statues? Why are we looking up to these people who were so cruel to so many people and enslaved people? So the question was asked to the Archbishop that this depiction of white Jesus in the churches, a statue, so to speak, white complexion and blue eyes, should this not be taken down? Is this not wrong? And to which he replied, yes, perhaps this is wrong and we need to look into it. So, how much has this been a perception? And I'm speaking to you from someone who's been in America and also in Africa. Is this not a question that is asked, that, how can we pray to a God who has a white complexion? Is it, what's your take on this?
Yeah, that is the teachings of the church. But if you think about Africans' conception of God, it's completely different. In fact, there is a big debate in African philosophy about Africans' belief in the existence of one God. So I would cite somebody like Kwame Gyekye, who is an African philosopher, who says that if you look at every African language, you will see that they mention things always with God, and the emphasis is on one God. So we can separate the teachings of the church, which came later, with the Africans' own conception of God. It's always one God. So, for example, I'm an Akan. The typical Akan, if you ask a typical Akan, how are you doing? The response is always, by the grace of God. It is always, what to say, if you are traveling somewhere, he says, because of God, and so on, which is very different from what has become the teachings of the church. So you go to a Catholic church, you will see a white Jesus there. But, that is the church. But if you ask the African what he or she believes, they will tell you they believe in one God.
Has this, because you have this, experience living in two countries, in Ghana and in America, has this been, as part of what Dr. Basiyr was mentioning and what Maulana Sahab was mentioning, this perception that is created of the white person being higher, has this played into that narrative?
Yes, it has. It has, to the extent that, let me give you a backstory. In Ghana, at some point in time, during the colonial rule, if you wanted to go to school, most schools were run by the church. So if you had a Muslim name, you couldn't get into school. So I know a number of Ghanaians, some of them Ahmadis. All boys went to school, everybody was called Joseph because his name is Ibrahim, but in order to get into the school, which was run by some church, he changed his name. So we call them Brajo Senior, Brajo Junior, Brajo, like that. All of them, they didn't throw away their Muslim names, but in order to get to the school, they had to call themselves Christians to get in there, right? So yes, to some degree, this whole idea of superiority is there. It was used on colonial rule, the way colonial masters, quote unquote, treated the local people. And some still do believe. Unfortunately, maybe this is the case as a political scientist, that in some cases, local political leaders have not done justice to their role of leadership and have, in many cases, used the same kinds of tactics that the colonial authorities use so that they can also govern. But there's absolutely no question about the feeling sometimes of inferiority of Africans over black. Now that's not the same as the feeling that you have living in, speaking to a friend of mine who's African American, say, well, as bad as your place may be, you still can go there and say, it's my home, right? But if you live in America, you're an African American, where would you, this is your home, right? You can't, there isn't any place that you can say it's your home. This is your home. And so that distinction also has to be made, that while these levels of inferiority or superiority complexes are there, it is still a little different in the African American case, or black person living in America.
Yeah, I should mention, even the Archbishop acknowledged the fact that, if anything, the most accurate depiction probably of Jesus, peace be upon him, should be Middle Eastern, brown. But there are, he even acknowledged the fact that there are churches who depict the black Jesus, and there are churches in other places who depict, in China, for example, a Jesus which matches their, his mold. Thank you for joining us in today's show. Make sure you leave your comment below, join in the discussion, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel. And also, do not miss our next episode, where we're going to begin to look at some solutions which are often overlooked.